Hey everyone, this is Robert Keynes, and I'm talking to Fernando Aguirre, who has formerly lived in Argentina, is from Argentina, and has recently moved to Spain. And one of the reasons we're chatting today is because he is one of the survivors of the economic crisis that occurred in Argentina, and is going to be here to tell a little bit about his story. And I think it's important to talk to other people that have those stories because there are a lot of similarities in what happened in Argentina to what happened in the U.S. So thank you for joining me, Fernando. How are you today?
Thanks, Rob. Doing very well, thanks.
Okay, great. So if I have it correctly, and we'll just talk a little bit about your background, you grew up in a fairly well-to-do middle-class family who was well-educated, and they worked, I think a lot of them in the financial industry. Is that correct?
Yeah, my father, he was a banker his entire life. My mother, an accountant. So, yeah, you would say upper middle class, so to speak, would be correct.
Okay. And Argentina at one point was one of the more affluent countries, correct? And then, what time did that start changing, and what did you guys notice?
Well, most of the 90s were pretty economically speaking. Although living in a lie of an economy, there was money all around. You were making your income in Argentine currency, which was paired to the dollar. So wages in Argentina in dollars were even better than those in the United States for most of the 90s.
Okay. And so what happened that you think that led to the economic collapse? Or can you kind of walk us through the steps of what you saw while you were there?
Sure. Argentina has always been complicated, to say the least, politically. There's been dictatorships, there's been economic crises every 10 years or so. The thing is that during the 90s, with this parity of the US dollar with the Argentine peso, it wasn't really. It was based on a lie. The idea that a dollar and a peso are the exact same thing, it's simply not true. This was killing the national industry. It was being financed by ever-increasing debt, and at the same time destroying the national industry because everything was much cheaper being brought from abroad. By the time people realized this, by the time the market saw what was happening, it crashed horribly in 2001.
And so did the government depeg the peso from the dollar, or what was their move at that point?
Well, there was a bank run. People try to get their money out. I mean, at the time, again, it was $1, $1 peso. Either one, you would have your bank account, or in pesos, it was the same thing. When people went to get their dollars out, they were told, no, you don't have that money here anymore. As you can imagine, the bank run was impossible to deal with, like all bank runs are. So they froze people's accounts, they closed the bank's doors, and you just couldn't get a cent out of the bank anymore.
Okay, so it sounds like they basically devalued the currency, maybe not through an official announcement, but through the banking system. So if you had money stored in the bank, they weren't giving you dollar for dollar what you had there. They were devaluing it by giving you less than what you had.
During those first days, it was December 18th, if I remember it well, December 2001. At first, it just closed the bank's doors and you just couldn't get anything. Now, right after that, they devaluated to $1, 1.14. Quickly, it was $1, 3 pesos, and basically, in a matter of days, it devaluated 6%, 70% of the.
Right. So the currency got devalued at that point in time. What happened to the other financial instruments like stocks and bonds and things that people maybe have saved their money in?
Well, for a time they were, especially if you were buying from in the U.S. market, they were protecting money. But as you can imagine, the stock market in Argentina crashed. But everyone was trying to get their money out of the bank. So the was fair game.
Do you know if there were any issues of people getting their money out of the stock market? Like, did the brokers have any issues giving people their money?
it out because banks were not giving you the money. I mean, you could have it into your bank account, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the only way you could use it was if you had using it with your debit card. Now the thing is, most stores were not accepting debit or credit anymore during that time, and that lasted for quite some time. So you were basically trapped in the banking system. You could make certain payments with debit, with banks transactions, but yes, it was a instrument to use stocks so as to secure your assets.
Okay, but the stock market crashed quite a bit. Do you know what the level of crash was? Was it sort of like Black Monday in the U.S., or was it worse than that?
Yeah, it was. I don't remember exactly, but it was impaired with everything else in the country. I mean, keep in mind that this was not only just an economic matter; it was a social political issue. The
Hmm.
president resigned, and after him, the next president resigned again, and after him, the next one, and we had five different presidents in a week. So when we say that the economy collapsed in Argentina, is because it indeed the entire country certainly collapsed during that time.
Okay. And in terms of the government debt, were there issues with the government debt, and did the IMF have to step in, or what happened to the debt at that time?
Well, we defaulted on our debt. It was, if I'm remembering right, $32 billion default. So it was at the time it was the largest default ever. So you lost credit with everyone, and especially after that. For years, Argentina was blacklisted. In the only country that was lending us money was Venezuela. So up until very recently, actually, it was a situation Argentina lived for over a decade.
Okay. And in terms of employment, what happened there? Were companies laying people off? Because I imagine if there's not as much money in circulation, it's hard to buy goods and services. And when it's hard to buy goods and services, maybe the companies aren't selling as much, and so that would affect employment as well. So is that sort of what happened? People were losing their jobs, or were you able to hang on to your job during that time?
A lot of people had already lost their jobs at the end of the 90s because of this parity of the U.S. dollar and the Argentine peso. Everyone was dollar rich in Argentina, so everything was cheaper, just being bought from abroad. That destroyed the national industry, and there were factories closing. There was very little national industry to go about. Employment getting closer to 2001. Our exact percent we reached at the worst about after 2001. It was an honest 25% unemployment, maybe more than that. Yeah, it was quite bad employment-wise.
Yeah, that sounds a lot like the Great Depression in the U.S. I think the official unemployment was somewhere around 25% as well. So wow, that's pretty steep.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of the currency reset, you mentioned that it was like $1 to 3 pesos at one point. So when you're paying debt off, like if you have a mortgage or credit card balance or something, how does that new exchange rate, how did that affect people paying off their bills?
Well, it really depended on how your specific debt was acquired and what kind of contract you had. You had that pretty much destroyed you because you were earning money in Argentine pesos. All of a sudden, your debt duplicated, tripled itself. If you had a loan, for example, if you got $10,000 and you had to pay those back in pesos, then you actually made a good deal in that case. But the thing is, in Argentina, most people did not have mortgages for their homes. That's not nearly as common as it is in the United States. It was about personal loans for industry. But for those that had it for homes, if you had to pay it back in dollars, most likely you just ended up losing your home.
Okay. I recently wrote an article for Seeking Alpha documenting the current issues that Argentinians are having with the peso. And it looks to me, it looks like a hockey stick chart where it looks like it wants to go back into a hyperinflationary mode. And I think recently it settled down because the IMF is loaning out another 54 billion to the country. But from your perspective, because Argentina has sort of been through this before, if the IMF loans them a lot of money, do you think that the government is going to fix things and that the currency crisis will settle down again, or do you think it's going to get worse, in your opinion?
The good news is that the new president, well, he's not new, but he's been in office already 3 years. Mauricio Macri is more of a technical. The guy is actually a civil engineer, and he is by all accounts an honest politician, at least as honest as they come. But he's honestly doing a good job in terms of doing what he can with a bad situation. So the money that is now being loaned, it's at least it's not being downright stolen like it was with the previous government. Mm-hmm. It's being invested. There's more construction. There's more roads. There's more infrastructure. There's incentives for it. So there's hope there. The thing is, next year there's going to be elections, and there's a slight chance that if he loses, things could go back once again.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit about the government which was in power during the time that you were in Argentina and were having these problems? Would you describe it more as a Republican type of government like the United States had, or I would say the United States used to have? I'm not sure we're as much of a republic now as we used to be. Or is it more of like a socialist democracy, or what was the type of political system that was in place?
Best way to describe it would be a left-leaning, kind of like a Chavez, Maduro in Venezuela, but slightly more evolved and slightly more polite than that. But at the end of the day they're now being charged as a criminal organization. They're about to go to jail. The vice president of Argentina is already in jail. He was a petty thief. He's been charged, he's been found guilty, and he's now serving time. Cristina Kirchner, she was the previous president, and she came after her husband, Nestor Kirchner. By all accounts,
Okay. I see some similarities in what happened in Argentina with what's going on in the U.S. now, and just to kind of briefly describe those, it seems as though the U.S. is probably about to enter some sort of currency crisis, in my opinion, because while it's still the world reserve currency, it looks like other countries are actively negotiating dollars for oil outside of the U.S. currency. The petrodollar seems to be dying. You've got China and Russia doing yuan and other contracts for oil outside the dollar. You have some of the Middle Eastern nations doing contracts with other countries for oil for gold, for example. And you see people sort of moving away from the U.S. dollar at the same time that the bond rate, the debt rates on the U.S. debt is going up. So from a economic perspective, I don't think the dollar is in as strong a place as it used to be, and it seems like we have such a high debt that that issue is eventually going to come home to roost, especially when the rest of the world's kind of moving away from it. And to another extent, I think China and Russia are also buying tons of gold. And now you're starting to see some Middle Eastern and some European countries, especially Eastern European countries, buying more gold as well. And gold is a tier one asset to central banks. It really, even though we haven't been on a gold standard in a long time, gold is seen as sort of a very important underpinning to the financial system. And I think from the United States perspective, we haven't had an audit of our gold reserves since the 1950s. So that's 60 some odd years. I did spend 12 plus years as an auditor. And so I worked for a couple of companies like Ernst & Young and KPMG and some others. And so I had a lot of professional training in that field. And, what I notice as an auditor is if you don't keep on top of the honesty of an organization, the transparency of reporting what they have, it may not actually be there, or the situation may be quite a bit different than what we think. And so I think the U.S. also may have quite a few less gold reserves than they're reporting. I don't think we have the 8,000 tons that everybody thinks we do. So I think it's very possible that the U.S. it doesn't have as many gold reserves as, say, China and Russia, for example. And that eventually, if there is a financial crisis, that the U.S. dollar is going to weaken severely because of that, because we're not going to have our gold backing, because we have so much debt and the bond rates are going up. and there just seems to be a lot of uncertainty around the U.S. dollar as people using it as a world reserve currency right now. Could you imagine a scenario in which the U.S. dollar faces a lot of the same issues that you guys face in Argentina with your currency?
I mean, it's something that if you get a little bit more philosophical, everything has its cycle. Every empire eventually falls, and every fiat currency that's basically nothing but its own debt just ends up crumbling eventually. And you see today, especially in the political aspects that you have internationally, everyone is kind of watching their own back. You know, especially with Europe, about we cannot trust in U.S. having our back all the time anymore. Not militaristically, not financially. So everyone is kind of watching their own little plot of land, right? And
Right.
I believe it's only natural to eventually say, you know, yeah, the dollar is fantastic, we love it, but I want my own thing just in case. And it's like everyone is becoming a little bit of wary about trusting something they don't control anymore.
Right.
And yes, I mean, who could possibly say exactly when it would happen, but it's perfectly possible. I completely agree in that regard.
Yeah, I do agree that fiat currencies have had many issues over the years, and I don't think the dollar will be immune from it, especially if people are moving away from it. And I think you made some good points about the geopolitical realignment that seems to be going on across the world. It seems like some of the European countries are moving east, and they're turning towards China and Russia for supplies for natural gas and for trade. And it seems like, Trump is trying to do his best in the U.S. at trying to maintain trade, but the way he's doing it is also creating some more tensions, especially with China. And so it just seems as though this realignment is going to affect the financial system, because I don't think you can separate politics and economics. I think they kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And so as we see this realignment around the world, I think it's going to put pressure on the dollar. It's going to put pressure on different currencies. So you may have a unique perspective from Spain, where you're living now. Tell us a little bit about what's going on in Spain and what you see in Europe.
Well, I mean, to be completely honest, what I see is that Americans don't understand Europe. They honestly do not. There's this thing about, well, to a point it's understandable, but many Americans think that the European Union is just this evil organization enslaving poor European countries. The simple fact is that every European Union member, except for Britain, that is now sort of leaving because it's actually not leaving anymore, with with a Brexit only in a Brexit that's not really a true Brexit after all, by what it seems as of right now.
Yeah.
With every country has done better economically than before. And if you look at, for example, Greece would be your typical, the Greek government would be, right? Those socialists over there. Then you have the guys over in Italy, but you cannot say that the current president in Italy is a socialist. He's very much right-leaning kind of guy, very much area of immigrants, and yes, they all agree on being within the European Union and being out of it when it comes to what they actually do. None of them are talking about leaving it, because at the end of the day, 27, 28 countries working together are better than 28 little countries on their own in a world that is increasingly sheltering. The European Union has to stick together, because if not, no fish in the pond.
Yeah. So you're saying that you think the European trade zone is going to stay together because they have so much riding on the fact that together it's so much easier for them to compete in this world, especially with this changing geopolitics, with China rising, China becoming much of a superpower, that it makes more sense for Europe to stay together than it does for every country to sort of fend for itself.
Exactly. You have China. I mean, you have Trump in America. He said it himself. It's America first. He's not going to be backing Europe. He's not going to be backing Britain. He's not going to be backing anyone but U.S. And that's exactly what he should be doing. No one should expect anything else. Why should the United States come to the rescue of Britain when it's leaving the European Union out of its own choice? No one forced them to do anything. Now, at the same time, you have a very complicated situation there because even though they had a referendum, people voted to leave. There's lots of good, honest people that voted for that, and they thought they could just cut out of the European Union, just leave. The fact is that after almost 50 years of being part of that system, you can't do that. You can cut yourself out of the European Union and do your own thing, but you have to roll back to 1970. That is suicide by all accounts. It's impossible to do, and that's why you're now seeing that Brexit is going to be happening, but it's going to be staying within the common customs mark. It's going to be Brexit in words only.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point. And there seems to be a lot of unhappiness with certain people in Britain about Theresa May and the way that Brexit is sort of going. And it seems as though she's between a rock and a hard place because she's trying to maintain some sort of relationship with the European Union at the same time. The will of the people had said that they wanted to leave. So it seems to be a very difficult spot. And I think that does speak to the fact that everybody's sort of looking out for themselves. And I think the reason people are looking out for themselves is because there's so much uncertainty in the world that it's almost like people are trying to jump off the Titanic in a way. It's like they see the ship sort of sinking and they're each trying to jump off into their individual lifeboat, but maybe there aren't enough lifeboats, right? And maybe to some extent, it's like a game of musical chairs where at the end of the game, somebody's going to be left standing and not have a chair to sit in. And those geopolitical alignments are really going to therefore affect the economic situation.
If you're not part of one of the big groups, if you're not one of the big fish in this current moment in the world, you are in a tough position. You're in a tough position to negotiate with anyone else, right? Again, going back to the Brexit thing, yes. UK can negotiate on its own with different countries. Countries, right? The leverage you have being part of a 28 country group is not the same leverage you're going to be having on your own. And every country, every small nation around the world is in that position. So either you're one of the big guys or you're one of the tiny ones. No one wants to be a tiny guy at this moment.
Right. Taking it back just a moment to Argentina and those Latin countries, do you think that those Latin countries are going to be able to work together? It seems as though, as they have different issues like with Brazil and Venezuela and Argentina, it seems the economic issues are turning into political issues in a way and it seems like there's a lot of animosity between the different political regimes. Do you see those countries being able to work together much like Europe is trying to work together and stay in these political and trade unions? Or do you think that each one is going to go their own separate way and sort of be on their own?
I think with the trend that we see, again, not your own country, but it's even better if, the United States is at the end of the day, 50 states together. It's a massive country. It's a pretty unique situation. Everyone else, they have to do something so as to form their own little group and have leverage, have a gravitational weight. Argentina would be part of the Mercosur, right? It was for many years not fully exploited to its potential, let's put it that way, mostly because politically speaking, Latin America has been a huge mess. But now with Macri in Argentina, you have Bolsonaro in Brazil, which is a very much a conservative, right-leaning guy that by some miracle won in Brazil. There and Chile, so there you have three countries that they could get their act together and start something interesting. With a little bit of luck, they could get a Mercosur union in Latin America going on and having quite a bit of strength down the road.
Yeah. And bringing it back to the United States, I think the United States does depend quite a bit on those Latin American countries. As we were speaking before the interview, I live in Texas, and we do a lot of business with Mexico, and a lot of our labor actually comes from Latin American countries. And it's part of what makes Texas so strong is this diversity of talent that we're able to incorporate. And it certainly made us more resilient, I think, in Texas and certain other areas. Because I think also because Texas tend to be so business oriented. Do you have any comments on the different trade agreements that Trump has negotiated with Canada and Mexico? And do you have any thoughts on whether those would be positives or negatives for the U.S. and also for Latin America?
Trump, at the end of the day, is a business guy. He's going to be doing what works best for the United States, but he's also going to be reasonable, and he will have to accept that the other side also has its own interests. He's not going to be doing anything that's going to be damaging the United States, and eventually they're going to be finding a way to work things out, as businessmen usually do. So I would be very much surprised if something drastic happens with Mexico with Canada.
Okay. And I think the last topic for this interview, I want to bring it back around to personal finance and personal economics. Because a lot of what we talk about on this channel on Seeking Alpha is how to maximize income, how to maximize investment, but also how to manage wealth. So once you have wealth, how do you manage that wealth and maintain it? Certainly, a lot of people are into stocks and bonds and real estate and different things. Should the United States go through a big economic downturn, whether it be just a regular business cycle or whether it be something worse, such as having some sort of currency crisis or debt crisis, based on your experience in Argentina, what would you recommend for our listeners here to help protect their wealth and basically also just to have enough money to be able to operate every day? What types of things would you say would be good places to put their money?
Well, what happened in Argentina was pretty much extreme, but my advice in general is quite simple. Have at least a month worth of expenses in cash. Cash, as the saying goes, is king. And the truth is, when things get very complicated, cash can be quite useful, even if it's depreciated. In Argentina, people the dollar for stability. If something like that happens in the United States, maybe some other alternative currency could be an option. But to be honest, I would rather have precious metals in my pocket than anything else if the dollar is crashing. That's just my opinion, and based on what I saw in Argentina, precious metals kept their value as the currency collapsed. It's true that for us in Argentina, the dollar was that stability, but for everyone else, the major currencies are in that position. I'd rather have gold and silver, especially gold. And then the only thing that proved stable in Argentina at the time was hard assets, especially if you had real estate. That was something that kept its value quite nicely. If you were renting it out, rent went up proportionally, so you kept your investment generating a similar amount of income for you. Those would be the things I would stick to.
Okay, so it really sounds like the hard assets, the physical assets that you can actually touch and feel versus paper assets. So the gold and silver, having some cash to pay your immediate debts, going into income producing real estate, for example, that you own and is very physical and has physical value to people seems to be the way to go. So compare that to other paper versions of those assets. For example, let's say a REIT or a real estate investment trust where you're investing in, say, a collection of retail shopping malls or something. Do you feel like that would be safe, or do you say stick with the actual real estate that you own that you control?
In my experience, and keep in mind that my experience means having seen every single bank you know of, every single one of them closing their doors and telling us tough luck, you don't have a cent anymore. That's been my experience with banking. So
sure,
I really have a hard time trusting banks in general. There are necessary and you use them and such, but the same thing. For example, you were mentioning something related to malls and such. As soon as business starts going down, many of them are going to be going bankrupt. They're not going to be making a sale. People in Argentina wouldn't buy a bucket of paint to paint a wall during that time. Everyone was waiting to see what was going to be happening, and the market just froze for months. No one spent a single cent. So if you're going to be preparing for something like that, you should keep that in mind as well. Yes, the things that you can actually have under your control, those are the ones I would trust the most.
Okay, and in terms of gold, there's derivatives of gold like gold ETFs like the GLD and silver ETF like SLV. A lot of people trade those, I think, just to get access to the gold and silver markets. But in terms of some sort of severe economic downturn or currency crisis, those probably aren't going to be as valuable because you're not easily going to be able to go and turn in your shares of that to get the real physical gold, right? So you would still recommend having gold in your possession or gold that you can get to very easily.
I know that's useful. Some people do it, but I would be very wary. Especially again, we're talking about when things go really wrong, and many of these companies may go bankrupt overnight. You know, if they just close their doors, I mean, you have to understand the position of being all these institutions you trust so much. One day they close their doors, and we've seen hundreds, thousands of people with an actual hammer on the doors of the banks. So yeah, I would be careful about trusting very much into that.
Okay. Yeah, so it sounds like basically protect yourself. Don't leave everything in the bank and don't leave everything with your broker. And a lot of these passive investments that are so popular in America right now, through people's 401ks and things, people may have less access to them. So it definitely, a good strategy financially would be to try to convert those into hard assets, which you control, which you have in your possession, and that you're closer to so you can access them when you need to. I think that sounds like what you're advising.
At least have a percentage of that secured in a manner that if things go wrong, a percentage of that is under your own control.
Okay, fantastic. Well, Fernando, I thank you very much for this portion of the interview. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap that up. I appreciate very much your perspective, which is very unique and certainly very unique to what we've experienced in the U.S. I think we haven't had real severe financial issues, some of the recent crisis notwithstanding, since the Great Depression. And I think every 80 years or so, we seem to have one of these big economic issues. And so I certainly think we could have that in the U.S. in the next few years. So I appreciate your perspective. I think it's been very valuable, very much. And for those of you listening, we're going to do an after-hours interview with me and Fernando, and we're going to talk about an expanded list of subjects. So if you're interested, go to my YouTube channel, and we'll provide that content over there. Fernando, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.